Right. It is a great pleasure to be here at the American Library again and to see familiar faces, but also to have the opportunity to speak about changing the world for women with a woman who has changed the world quite so much as this one. Now, we are going to look briefly at the past and Catharine's work, which is anthologized in the Butterfly Politics book. But tonight we agreed to focus more on questions facing women now, and in particular on questions concerning sexuality, equality, and consent in feminist discourse and the judicial definition of rape. And for those of us who are in Paris this February of 2024, these questions are pertinent because we are in a country where how to define rape juridically is currently a live question. The Assemblée Nationale has a proposition before it to adopt a consent definition of rape that more closely aligns with the definitions of Anglo-Saxon countries and some other EU member states, including Sweden. Before we turn to that, however, I'd like to start by asking Catharine about her early work in feminist theory and in law. And this is because your reputation and subsequent work, including Le Viol Redéfini, her book on a movement towards equality and against consent in judicial definitions of rape, builds on the theory that you developed and have developed over your career. So, as someone who has taught many of your theoretical texts, I found reading Butterfly Politics incredibly inspiring because it has texts that are activist texts, legal texts, many texts from different domains of your work. But in the front of each one, there are these little preambles where you reflect on them retrospectively. And I wanted to just mention a couple of these because I found them inspiring. So one from an early commencement speech that you gave struck me because you said that you wondered why the women were honoring you for what you did. You said, these are things that so obviously needed doing, things anyone could have done. I can't be the only reader who thought, maybe? And in the concluding chapter, Intervening for Change, which is a longer reflective piece, you write that you decided to go to law school because, quote, I did not believe male lawyers I watched enjoying their godlike position of saying, no, that's impossible, to most things women wanted law to do. So in your early work, which partly theorizes what it's like for women to live under the impossibilities that men impose on them, you claim that to face women's subordination, to face the reality of women's position in society, we need a theory that sees that sexuality is to feminism what work is to Marxism. What does that mean, and why is that what we need?
Well, thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to everyone for coming, and to the American Library here in Paris for having us all. The sentence that follows that sentence is that which is most one's own, yet most taken away. Okay? And so work in Marxism is that through which you are both productive, create value, and have dignity, and at the same time, under capitalism in particular, all of that is alienated from you, taken away, expropriated. To me, that was, at the time, and I actually still think so, in form at least, if not in content, the best theoretical critical construction that I had seen. And so when I say sexuality is to feminism as work is to Marxism, what I was attempting to do was to provide for feminism what at the time I thought it didn't have, I thought we didn't have, which is a full theory from epistemology to the state that centers on the core problem of oppression. What is this oppression about? Okay, Marx answered that question. This oppression is about extracting your work from you and turning it into a form of profit for other people. Okay, with sexuality, it seemed to me, if you looked at feminism the way I was then doing, but also, to be honest, I was creating the feminist theory that saw it this way, but building on what people had done at the time. I wrote this in about 1972, I believe, that sentence and the parts of it around it. The idea was that as capitalists want and extract work from workers, men as a class want and extract sexuality from women. And they tell you that this is your value, when in fact it's their ability to use you for it that they're valuing. And that the entire arrangement is a kind of scam to tell you that this is yours, when in fact it's being expropriated, exploited, used, violated in both systematic and actually structural ways. And that what we first needed to do was to see the world, see that in the world, see that being done on us and to us, and us being made into the people that actually participate in it, and often see our own value in those same terms. And why wouldn't we? That's how we're valued around us in a deterministic way, in a power structure that we did not create, but is creating us. And so from epistemology, we need to first see the whole thing differently, and moving all the way through sets of social relations and everything that feminism had already talked about. Work, family, reproduction, everything that, all have sexual dimensions, but instead of talking about the sexuality that is a through line of the subordination in all those dimensions, there were people who said, family is the core of the problem of the subordination of women. And a whole other group of people said, actually the linchpin of this whole thing is reproduction. And that whole debate is still going on. But what I was saying is, look, the family's organized the way it is because of the sexuality that men want to be able to have access to, and without any question. And reproduction, ordinarily speaking, is a consequence of actually a sexual interaction. In other words, if you start to exfoliate all these other things, as well as what women's work is valued for, which is less and lower and often highly sexualized, a great deal of it, but kept down, and mostly it's a monetization of what we do in the family for nothing. And anyway, all the way then to the laws that institutionalize all of these things, and the laws of sexual assault that, would be funny if it weren't so painful to so many, women in particular, and sometimes men, in not recognizing the way the violation is both stolen and sold, stolen in rape, sold in prostitution, and sex trafficking. But the way the laws are designed is so as to make it seem like something's being done about it, and to be able to be used by some men against other men when they feel like it, but not actually to address the way the injuries actually happen. And so that's, where it all started, and that's why my original book, Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, goes from epistemology to the state and talks about abortion law and why it's all about the wrong questions, and predicted that the whole thing was going to crash, which it just did in the U.S., talks about pornography, talks about and prostitution together, talks about rape law, and actually this question of consent that that Kate nicely framed.
So we'll turn soon to law. But first, I have a question about making sexuality so central to the theory of feminism. And this is one of the risks that Beauvoir identifies as a problem facing any woman who thinks about the status of women in society, which is that for too much of history, women have been defined either negatively as not men, or relatively in relation to what men want of them, but not positively as they are in themselves. Do you think that this is a worry, a legitimate worry, to put to your conception of sexuality as being to feminism what work is to Marxism? Are we accepting the premise that this is what makes us who we are?
I don't think so, in that the facing what's being done to us, I think, is the first step in doing something about it. And the alternative is denying the power that this has in our lives and this is actually the American postmodern move, sort of creative misinterpretation as a strategy for political change. Let's just act like this isn't happening, sort of in this one at a time way. And doesn't do anything. So I think that the worry is a valid worry in itself. I just don't think it's a worry about this theory. The question is, what is the real meaning of this concept, who women are in ourselves? Particularly under conditions in which we are overwhelmingly not permitted to have lives that are so self-defined. There's a lot of resistance in women to that. And women see through it a lot and find creative ways to both resist and reconstruct their possibilities. What we're trying to do all the time, as well as reconfigure these possibilities, for ourselves and for all women. But what I think is wrong with that approach to it is it acts as if us theorizing reality for what it is and centering on the problem that is the core central reality problem, it's as if we have the power to make that be a worse problem by facing it as a problem. And I think that's just upside down. I think it's backwards, it's reversed, it's wrong. It also is like idealist in a very, in a certain existentialist way, if I could just say.
Thank you. Yes, so one of the themes that runs throughout butterfly politics is this reality-first approach to both theory and law. And a claim that recurs in your legal work is that Anglo-American, and perhaps especially American, legal debates about inequality employ the paradigm of equality as sameness and difference. And that likes should be treated alike and unalikes as unalike, as Aristotle put it. Why do you think that this is inadequate for redressing social inequality between men and women and others where there are hierarchical differences?
Well, first of all, Aristotle, when he created this very opaque phrase, which was grabbed onto by the Enlightenment and, then the dead white male British liberals for a couple hundred years to develop this idea from this opaque passage. Aristotle was not thinking about structurally unequal societies and the need to make them equal. His model was the Greek polis, where where all the people who are already unequal are already excluded from it to begin with, and he wasn't even thinking about them. It didn't include women, it didn't include so-called strangers, i.e. people who weren't already Greek, it didn't include barbarians, see also the same. It didn't include slaves, they had slaves, it didn't include prostituted people who were women overwhelmingly, it didn't include children. Okay, so they're already out of the picture. So here's his likes alike, unlikes unalike. And the reason he wants equality is because if men are like other men and they don't have the same things those other men have, that creates destabilization in the system. It creates conflict and the possibility for violence, and we don't want this. Now, so first of all, it was never recognizing the structural social problems that it began by assuming out of the theory, and it was never a theory of social change, and it was never a legal theory. So, big deal Enlightenment and post-liberalism has hitched its wagon to this star and, gone off as if this can do that kind of work. Or maybe knowing that it can't is another way of looking at it. So it's entirely uninquisitive about either the standard for sameness that it embodies, which actually is the hierarchically superior, in the United States, it's white, male, Anglo model. That's who you have to be the same as to get what they have, because somehow by an accident of birth, you're not that person, but you've got to be the same as them anyway in order to have an equality claim. Now, does this strike anyone as not being highly likely? In a society that is unequally structured? So it's only the most elite, the most privileged, the smallest number of people who are not members of those groups who even have a chance of claiming equality, because they've already got to start out by being the same as this standard of comparison. And this thing is called neutral, by the way. Okay, so we have a hierarchical structure and presented as a lateral one. And, they just have more than you do, but you're the same as them. But you've already got to be the same as them. In other words, you have to already have equality in order to be able to claim it legally. So that's the sameness piece. It's also, and it completely doesn't know this. Again, why this took me, being born in a farm in Minnesota, and just sort of dropped off the potato truck last week, to point this out baffles me. Okay, but actually, no one did before. Okay, so then there's the difference piece, about which they are equally uncurious. What do you mean by differences? Well, the things they call differences, there's two possibilities with it. Sameness is first-class equality, right? You got to, have climbed yourself up already to their level, without any help of law. You already got to be there, and then you can claim you've been discriminated against. That's first-class equality. Second-class equality is you get compensated for, oh, poor you, the differences that have befallen you. Well, we've just lost on that one, okay? I've been telling people this is second-class equality. They're going to say it never, you can't do this. And anyway, the United States has just decided you can't do this anymore, called affirmative action being invalidated, meaning actual relief being treated equally. Actually, okay, diversity is the most un-Aristotelian value on the planet. It means treating unalikes alike on the basis of their unalikeness, value their unalikeness, see, and give them what people who aren't like them already have, because they bring something that those other people haven't brought. No way. It's absolutely contrary to Aristotelian equality theory. And I knew that they were going to kill it, okay, which they did. Last Supreme Court session. The other approach to differences is you can be treated worse based on your differences, because that's treating unalikes unalike. So you can be treated better, right? As I say, they just decided that isn't going to work. We're over that. We don't need to do that anymore, apparently. Having never really much done it, but okay. And never in a way that's really solved anything, although it did help some. Okay. But now we can't even do that because you're using a classification, and that's the problem, as opposed to keeping people down, which is apparently not the problem. Okay. But treating people differently based on their differences runs all the way to extermination, essentially. It isn't an act of inequality to impose genocide because you're treating unlikes unalike. Just to be very clear. You can, on the close end, you can pay them less because they're doing different work. And you can value that work differently even if all the people doing it are of a particular social group. Say they're brown, say they're black, say they're female, say they are immigrants or people who are undocumented and have fled for their lives from other situations. You can pay them dirt. You know, you don't have to pay them minimum wage. You don't have to, you pay them as little as they will work for, however, which is only a measure of their desperation. And that isn't a violation of unequal pay laws. In other words, unlikes unalike. Different work, different people getting paid differently, less. So that all the way through to, the citations to Aristotle under the Third Reich, which found that the final solution and everything leading up to it and integral to it did not violate equality law. And there actually are cites to this in German. The Germans don't do that anymore. They have repudiated that, but not entirely the Aristotelian sameness difference model, although the German Constitution has some real recognitions of remedying disadvantage and the possibilities of, and the need to recognize inequalities that exist now. Okay, that is amazing that that's in a constitution, because mostly it's not, in most countries. So that's why. Did anybody have that question anymore? Like, why does sameness difference not work to produce equality? I mean, this is the model we've been using. In case you're wondering why we've had this equality model all these years and we have no equality, start there.
Okay, thank you very much. So this brings us nicely to rape, because in your 2016 Harvard Law and Policy Review paper, Rape Redefined, you articulate a new approach to rape legislation that you think is more successful at providing women redress for sexual violation. And this is better than domestic laws about rape. Now, there's been quite a lot of movement and adoption of this at the international law level, but no domestic law has yet incorporated your approach. So what is the approach, and why do you think it would improve on domestic legislation?
Yeah, I've also worked internationally in all those places where they've accepted it, and it was useful to do. Anybody get a chance to do anything for the first time? Do it, okay? International law had no definition of rape. It's like, so somebody asked me, and I'm like, here. And, they wrote it down and did it. And, same thing happened in Canada, actually, around equality. So they have adopted, the fundamentals of my equality approach, although they seem to have forgotten the hierarchy part as time has gone on. But it's all, it's available there, and every so often gets reasserted in useful ways. And also, First Nations people are using it. There's a lot of context, in which it's being adopted, and a lot of soft law internationally uses it too, where both, in international law and in international how do you call these things? Well, treaties, treaty bodies, their adjudications of issues, including sometimes in regional systems in which the strong ones are Latin America and Europe, have adopted what actually is my analysis, which is that rape is a crime of inequality, in particular of gender inequality, intersectionally combined with every other inequality that exists in society, all the strong ones, which include, well, sex, gender identity, including non-binary and trans, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion. You know, age is huge. Disability is massive. You know, as inequalities usually through gender, but every human quality, every group membership that is used to keep people down, and hugely class and caste, as well as poverty generally, are sexualized and used to differentially target people for abuse, sexual abuse in particular. And so anyway, I created this theory, and the reason is because, I mean, there's a very simple idea here, which is that the law against a thing should embody the realities of that thing, so that when that thing happens to people and they say, this happened to me, the courts know what you're talking about. And since women haven't had any voice in any of this, nor have non-binary people or trans people or gay and lesbian people, in defining what the injuries are when differentially subjected to those injuries, as all women are, and then you say, this happened to me, you know, they learn basically not to bother with police or courts or civil remedies or anything, because nobody seems to know what they're talking about. There's no reflection of their reality in there. Okay, so getting women's reality into courts without, you know, women having to sacrifice themselves constantly to educate courts to these realities, and in particular this is egregiously experienced by women of color in the world as a whole, and absolutely, of course, in the West and everywhere. Having had no voice, the laws don't embody their experience. And so, you know, among the approaches that we have are this consent-based approach, and there are two sort of main models, but this actually excludes Islamic law, you know, a lot of Asian models, although a lot of them are completely overlaid by colonialism, reflect the Western hegemonic models. Islamic law less so, but still somewhat in some places. But anyway, these two models are the consent-based model and the force-based model, or coercion-based model. And the consent-based model is basically British, and the coercion-based model is basically French. And those are, and then in the United States, we combine them usually. And that means you have to be, in order to be raped, you have to be both be forced and have sex without your consent. Again, it seems to have taken me to say that's redundant. Nobody said that before. I mean, you know, I know women know this, they've felt this, they've seen this, but anyway, it had to get said somehow. So once you say it, everybody goes, once you say it, it's as if you haven't seen anything. It's as if you haven't achieved any insight because it's so obvious. I've just learned to get used to this. And, to like take it as a victory, because you say something and then people act like, oh, that's always been known, when in fact it's never been said, anywhere. I would have loved to have cited it, to somebody having seen it. Anyway, so in the U.S. we have to prove both, so that you can have a tremendous amount of force and they can still find that you consented, just so you know. And but the consent-only law means that if one goes along with what's being done to you, or if you acquiesce in it, or you feel like you really can't fight back, or you fight back unsuccessfully, somehow the burden is on you to stop being done to you what is being done to you, rather than on the person who's doing it not to be doing it anymore, or doing it at all. And the real issue is what's going on in your head. Consent is a subjective state of mind. It's what happens in the mind of the person who's claiming they were raped. And given that women are sexually defined, and in fact defined as being actualized by sex, if it looks like just a little bit too enthusiastic initiation by someone, or by usually a man, or tends to resemble what a trier of fact thinks of sex as being like, which actually involves a fair amount of force fairly frequently, they tend to think that she either wanted it, or at most there was a miscommunication, and anyway, who he is more important than what was done to her. And there's no conviction. And so anyway, the idea then has come up that we should just have a consent-only law, and that if you do this, that will solve this problem. And I think it's a bit of an ideological commitment that people have, thinking that it will mean that if you go in court and say, I said no, or I didn't say yes, that you will be believed, and that will be the end of it, because it really is a subjective reality. And here you are saying, you didn't want this, you never said you did. In fact, you said you didn't. That isn't the way it works. He says, first of all, he can say she did say yes. Or it can be that you said yes, but you didn't really want to do it, but it was under conditions of he's your employer, or he's your teacher, he's your father, stepfather, a whole range. And what he wants from you is that you say yes. And you know that. And you probably can't stop him anyway. And eventually the time comes when people, women in particular, say, actually, I'm done with this. I can't do this anymore. And so try to find support in institutions and don't find it. And so anyway, the consent idea puts her on trial. That's what it does. It's why the courts are interested in what was she thinking, what was she feeling, how do we learn that? We see, did she ever have sex before? Did she have sex with him before? Did she have sex with other men before? It's what was she wearing? Why did she get in his car? What was she thinking going up to his apartment? Lunch. You might think lunch was talking and having food. Well, apparently it's a sexual interaction. It just goes on and on. There's nothing women do that doesn't turn into being a sexual invitation. or don't do. So anyway, consent is this ultimately hierarchically defined, stereotypically active-passive. He says or does this. You know, she either lies down for it or tries to stop it, or doesn't, or goes along with it. So it's already not equal, because it's not an equal interaction. You know, he initiates it to begin with, and she either, quote, consents to it or not. You know, it finally dawned on me that they use this word consent like in surgery, you know? So here, surgery is cutting into a person, and it would be maiming if you didn't sign a consent form. I guess they think that sex is like that. They must, you know, because it's the same model. It's like you're being come into on, and apparently it's for your benefit once you commit the magic of allowing it. And wow, you know, suddenly rape is sex, and, you know, what would have been maiming is medical care. It's a remarkable idea. Anyway, there's a huge history for this, just to be very brief, in English philosophy. And it comes from the death of the divine right of kings. Okay. Here, time came when all of a sudden, because he's not descended from God anymore. So how do we justify the rule of the rulers over the ruled was the big liberal legal and philosophical question. They got a couple 100 years worth of thinking about it. A lot of heavy breathing. And its libraries are full of it. And so, but their big answer is consent. The consent of the governed, including tacit consent. Now, being smart, they say, well, how do you know that the people consent to the rule of the rulers over the ruled? Okay, first thing is they are there. Okay, they don't leave. Okay, well, I don't know where you're supposed to go or why you have to leave. You get to be there, no? But apparently not. You're there. Second, they are silent. They don't say they didn't want it. They don't deny the rule of the rulers. Okay. Third, they don't fight back. Well, okay, the state has armies, granted. But, you know, they don't raise their pitchforks and, you know, band together and decide to fight against these people in armor and on horses and whatever, later with cannons. They, you know, okay, so no resistance, okay? And fourth, they benefit from the state. This was a real, I mean, does this like remind you of anything, okay? She was there, she didn't say no. She didn't resist or resist enough. This is big in French law, by the way, the resistance thing. And then there's the benefit piece. And, you know, it finally really dawned on me. They really do think we benefit from this, okay? And we got to take this seriously. It just was such a bizarre notion. You know, it affirms us as women. It confirms our attractiveness, that they were overpowered by this desire to violate us, whatever. Just think about it however. So it's a benefit and an actualization of women. So that's the consent model. I don't know about you. Myself, the idea of the rule of the rulers over the ruled being a paradigm, that someone from public law and private law sort of flowing together at some point during those centuries, somebody will figure this out, probably at Oxford, when historically it actually physically happened, because somebody did this. Okay, somebody parked this big philosophy over there. But the theorists and the historians, legal historians, are very clear there was a flow through, all right, from what they call private law, which isn't very private. I'm talking about the criminal rape law now. And what they call public law, which is this rule of the rulers over the ruled business, and the legitimacy of the state, okay? Okay. This model of the rule of the rulers over the ruled is what they parked on our sex life and embodied it in their legal standards for it. And that's the way it's been under English law all over the world, in all these colonies that have had this imposed on them. So the current version of the colonized mentality is the United States uses this, Australia uses it, Canada uses it exclusively, although they have a better definition, but it still doesn't work, not really. But it's still consent only. And India, I mean, people act like it's a law of nature, like gravity. Consent, you know? Okay, so force is what the French law has been, but this consent idea comes up underneath it all the time because violence, contrainte, menace, and surprise, by which is not simply surprise by people who think of it that way in English. It's a faux ami. It actually means kind of being jumped on, you know, like with no notice. It isn't just, you know, surprise, it's your birthday and jumping out of a cake or something. It's not nice like that. But there are cases, you know, quite a few of them. Helene Devinc's book is full of this guy, like just like pouncing on women who work for him, a high media man. And she has a whole series of accounts of individual women. It's a really, really good book. It's called Impunity, Impunité in French, but does it exist in English? Does her book? I think not yet. Okay, well, read it. Anyway, the consent idea comes up underneath it in the form of, was there enough resistance? Because she shows all these forms of force, and then he says, well, but she consented because she didn't really fight back that much. And the courts say not enough resistance is an indication of consentement, and that means, in particular, there's no contrainte. So all the forms that could be contrainte are pretty routinely appear to be invalidated through. I thought French law meant you couldn't use something that wasn't written there in the law, you know. In the U.S., it's different, you know, it's a common law thing. Civil law, you're supposed to only use what's all in the civil code. Well, consent is not in the civil code. Okay, so now the current thing is, let's put it in there. This is disastrous. And the proposal is to flip French law so that consent is the main item and the 4 force forms show lack of consent, which all it does is make it a stronger, more difficult hurdle to prove absence of consent by showing enough force, because consent is the main term. So what I say is inequalities are all forms of force. They're actually forms of contrainte, including force morale, and fairly nicely recognized in the civil code in France, beautifully actually, spelled out in the civil code. Doesn't mean it's working perfectly, but it's laid out there. And so all these forms of inequality are the forms of force that I think just need to be brought forward and made clear, are forms of force that are already recognized in French law, but if they could be explicitly put there, then current litigators who are starting to use this idea, these inequalities as forms of contrainte in particular, and actually winning rape cases using it, don't have to reinvent the wheel every time there's a case. And it doesn't have to be only the most sort of advanced thinking French lawyers who do it. And you don't have to fight with the prosecutors to make it possible for you to bring it forward. It would just be right there where it belongs in the Code Penal.
So this raises very interesting questions about the relation between law and custom. And last week, there was an hour-long discussion on Mediapart in which Mélanie Vogel took part. She's one of the people who is behind this proposition de loi at the Assemblée nationale. And she uttered a sentence where she said that consent is what makes the action right or wrong. And so there's this idea which feminists have been discussing for a long time. Heidi Herd calls it moral magic, but it's the idea that consent is a normative transformer of sex. With it, it's good. Without it, it's bad. And I think a lot of feminists of my generation are pretty dissatisfied with this approach in law, but also in culture. So Manon Garcia's work is asking the question, among others, what is it that makes sex good? What sex are we fighting for as feminists? What is sexual liberation apart from the misogynist dream it was a while ago, which has become a worse nightmare? So the question that I often get from my students when they're reading your work is a similar question, because I think this discussion of what rape is in France concerns the question, what is sex? And there's a very funny anecdote in the beginning of Le Viol Redéfini. I mean, it's you might not find it funny, I suppose, but a French editor reacted to...
I didn't at the time, but I'm capable of seeing the humor in it.
Thank you. So a French editor reacted to your work on pornography by saying, Madame, your work is so violent, so violent. Women in France are not interested in these subjects. French women love sex.
All right? It's like...
But it raises this question, what is sex? Do they think it's something different?
Yeah, actually I think women do think that sex is something different from rape, from pornography, from prostitution. What is bought, what is stolen, what is sold, what is faked. And, you know, I think, you know, people want me to validate their sex life. This is a weirdness. But what I actually think is that against all the odds, it is possible to work toward having equal relationships. And the social structure is against that, between men and women, between men, with non-binary people, trans people, anybody. But people have glimpses of it and possibilities for it. And people are in partnerships that envision that as a possibility and sort of treasure it rather than taking it for granted or denying that there is anything that they're up against. And so, you know, my notion of this is to create equal conditions so that what people can have in the space between them, because this isn't just about any one person or any other person, it's a relational thing, right? It's in between us. So that what people can have in that space is something that grows them, and like, it doesn't have to be sex either, exactly. In any sort of, although it can include, you know, skin-on-skin forms, but you know, it's part of a larger picture of a whole life lived in relation to intimate people, and the reciprocity, the mutuality that's possible there in the construction of a life together. That is possible. And having a sexuality that is integral to that, you know, isn't simply about intercourse and orgasms and all that, but can include that. But really, for example, a lot of people think that being lesbian is simply a sexual preference, okay? However, there's like a whole community of women who envision and have an intimate life with each other that like is predicated on although doesn't guarantee it, a kind of equality between them. And at least there's gender and sex that gives you a better odds. Doesn't guarantee anything, but is helpful. But it isn't just about having sex with someone. It's about a whole life, lived in a context that, that you intimately, mutually, reciprocally create together, including with children and all. So I'm just saying that I think it's done a disservice to, say, gay and lesbian rights to exclusively focus on particular sexual acts. What's so interesting about it is when people have courts, powerful institutions are homophobic and deny people's rights, they focus on sexual acts. When they actually give people rights, as in marriage, family, etc., they don't even mention it. It's remarkable to read. They go commitment, mutuality, shared resources, children and their upbringing, which is as good there as anywhere. And, they look at the actual real values that animate people's relationships and their communities. So I just want to sort of give this a bit of a bigger frame. As I say, when people ask this question, they're usually thinking, okay, last night, how was that? How does that stack up against what she just said? And then they ask me about their current boyfriend. And, I'm sort of kind of wanting to say, well, we could talk about your past boyfriend, and we can talk about where you will be with the boyfriend you're with right now next year, okay? Or maybe 10 years from now. And then maybe we'll actually have something to talk about, because always what happened in the past isn't so good, but what happened last night is great. And, but talk about what happened last night 10 years from now, and it's going to be like what happened with your previous boyfriend, okay? So there's a temporality to this whole thing. And so, rather than, answer those questions on an individual level, I just wanted to give it a bit more breathing room.
So we are short of time. It has gone remarkably quickly. But I wanted to say one thing about le viol redéfini before we conclude, which is that it is not just the Harvard Law and Policy Review paper. It has many chapters which include a why now contribution, why you've done this in French. And I think for those of you who are interested in feminism and in intercultural feminism and in the relation between law and opinion change through literature, it's a remarkable achievement, which I commend to you, and thank you for. So
thank you so much for that.
Time now to
and my fabulous editor is right here as well, who had many pointed questions which improved the text immensely. Help translation person is here as well, who helped me work through all that in French, because I actually had, I think, 5 native speakers in addition to Flammarion people read the text, so that, and help with, including another one who's also here, so that it conveyed in French, as well as said the words, Yeah. Hopefully it does.
So it is time to take questions from the audience. Yep.
Thank you both so much. This was just incredible to sit through. The energy in the room has been amazing. We are short on time, but we do have time for some audience questions. So we'll start with our in-person audience. Raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone. Please don't be shy. We don't have any time to waste, so just go for it.
I also do want to say that the law in Sweden is not a consent-only law. I've read it. It's put out as that, but it's doing something a little bit different than that. So what is said about it and the consequences of it and what its terms are and so on aren't actually that, just so you know.
Hi, thank you so much for being here this evening. My question is about the definition of rape in international law. And does it consider that when women acquiesce, especially in respect to genocide or things that were happening, like for example in Rwanda or in the former Yugoslavia, that the life and death aspect of the acquiescence to what's happening to them?
Thank you so much for pointing that out and bringing that up. Yes, that is why we defined it the way we did, and did it in Rwanda actually, in the ICTR first. But the experience came from the Bosnian genocide also. It is defined as a sexual attack committed on a person under conditions which are coercive. Period. And so those coercive conditions were precisely the genocide that was taking place in both those situations. And there was no consent term in it. There was a lot of discussion about that. And some people, including in the US, when the ICTY, which is nowhere near as good, the Yugoslav tribunal, as the ICTR was, the Rwanda tribunal, decided to have a whole consent thing, and a whole bunch of criminal defense lawyers in the United States wrote a big thing saying, oh yeah, it's really important to have a consent item in this. My clients, who were the Bosnian women survivors of genocidal rape, essentially wrote them a letter saying, consent to rape in your own genocide, basically. And so, absolutely, we wrote it so that it was about the reality of the conditions. And when they tried to bring up, whether you acquiesced in the rape, someone raping you in exchange for them not killing your husband in the other part of the concentration camp, things like that. It's just, it doesn't mean it isn't rape. The conditions are coercive, period. And, that is my definition. And inequality is coercive conditions. And, the genocide is the ultimate inequality by being the ultimate in coercive conditions. Thank you.
Another question in the room?
It is the most important question out there. So thank you really very much for that.
And I think in both books, there are discussions of concrete cases of such coercive conditions, which are very difficult reading, but which make the point that you make so well, which is that we need to look reality in the face. This is what it's like.
We have a Zoom. Oh, we have an in-person question. We'll go in person.
Hello, Catherine. My question, I wanted you to maybe react on how the word consent was actually used in international law, but not only, to actually make prostitution allowed, because now in some international conventions, the fact that the woman actually consents is the difference between torture and work. So to show how the word consent, when is in law, because today in France, everybody knows that everybody wants to put the term consent in the criminal code, how it was used, this notion, and how the word was used in international law to actually make prostitution legal. And it's not only prostitution, it's actually torture, because prostitution is torture, sexual torture.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, everyone in France doesn't want to put consent into the criminal code, including Macron, who doesn't. But a lot of people don't, and a lot of women who work on issues of sexual assault in this country don't. In international law, it is clearly stated that if what we've been calling conditions of coercion, but are specified as abuses of power or conditions of vulnerability, for example, for purposes of sexual exploitation, that's the Palermo Protocol, which is adopted even by the United States, which doesn't adopt international things, which is amazing. But, you know, that I think is the right language. If those things are used to produce prostitution, if prostitution is happening in those circumstances, it is sex trafficking, and no consent to it is valid. But also from 1949 Convention on prostitution, transnational prostitution, or it can be within countries as well as between them. If consent is already precluded as making a condition of prostitution not illegal, it's what we're looking at here is the building of a double standard for sex, where if one is in prostitution, consent, and particularly if one is being pimped, which is about 92% on average that we know of women, including trans women, in prostitution internationally, you're being pimped. That is actually a third-party trafficker, which is exploitation of prostitution, hence sex trafficking, and also violation of the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women as well. Anyway, that body of law is clear that if those factors are present, that consent is invalid, but at the same and essentially it's serial rape, which is what prostituted women who survive long enough to talk about what happened to them and get past it call it. That's that standard. And over here we have women who overwhelmingly aren't in prostitution, at least some, and some countries trying to build on this British model, which has a conviction rate that dropped in the last 4 or 5 years from 6% of cases brought to 4%. All right? You want that? This is cases brought. And it's 1 to 10 of cases that happen that are even reported to start with. So think about these vanishing numbers, right? So consent is out when those conditions of coercion with regard to prostitution are present, whereas we're trying to get consent in to these cases of rape for people who aren't in prostitution. I just think that's wild. I mean, it's as if people don't, either there's 2 parts of their brain that aren't communicating, or they just don't know that. So, yeah, thank you indeed for that question, because, the international law context is very clear on the irrelevance of consent under those conditions.